Hello, I'm Graham and I hope everyone's having a great day and welcome to today's video. Now this video is at the request of a viewer who is having trouble trying to achieve a nice blur background for flower portraits. So in this video I'm going to show you how to achieve that using the camera that that person was using, which is the FZ1000 II. So it will apply to the FZ1000 and also the FZ2000-2500 as well, as they both have the Type 1" sensor. Now the first thing to consider with this particular camera is the fact that the crop factor, so that's the ratio of the sensor in this camera, it's diagonal to that of a full frame camera, is 2.75. So whatever aperture we set on this camera, to get the amount of depth of field that you would see on a 35mm full frame camera, you've got to multiply that aperture by 2.74 or 2.75 times. So if you say 3 stops, so with an f2.8 lens you're talking about f4, f5.6, f8. So you're talking about the amount of depth of field that you would get natively with a f8 setting on a 35mm full frame camera. So you can see we've already got an amount of depth of field which is quite large. If you're considering the FZ200, 300, 330 or FZ8082 with the 1/2/3" sensor, that crop factor goes up to 5.6. So if you've got a 2.8 aperture, you're talking about f11, f16. So you've got an amount of depth of field there which is very difficult to overcome and try and get some nice out of focus background, unless you apply some of the techniques that I'll be showing you in this video. Now, if you consider the 3 elements which create that amount of blur behind your subject, the first one is aperture, which we've just discussed, which is multiplied by 2.75 times to give the equivalent aperture on full frame cameras. The second one is the lens focal length. Now, if we've got a wide angle setting on the camera, say 25mm, that gives us a deeper depth of field than would be if you were shooting at the telephoto setting of 400mm. So to achieve the amount of shallow depth of field we require, we've got to be using the longer focal length of the camera. So anywhere between 300 and 400mm will give you a better chance of achieving this amount of blur behind your subject. And the other one is the subject to camera distance. Now, if you've got the subject close to your camera, then you will increase the amount of blur in your background, especially if you can keep the background far away from your subject. If the background is close to your subject, then obviously it will be rendered with almost the same focus as your subject itself. So the rules are try and keep your camera to subject distance close and your subject to background distance as far as you possibly can. And I'll be demonstrating all those in this particular video. So with the camera set to the AF macro mode, the closest focus distance you'll get when you're at the telephoto setting is something like 1 meter, and you measure that from your subject to the sensor plane. And with these particular cameras, if you consider the center of the mode dial to be your focal plane, that gives you a rough idea of the distance. So it's not from the front face of the lens, it's from that center of your mode dial to your subject as being that 1 meter distance. So try and keep the camera in the AF macro mode, but about 1 meter away from your subject, and keep the subject from your background using that telephoto setting of 400mm lens, and with an aperture between 4 and f5.6 to hit the sweet spot for the lens. But we use an aperture f4, f5.6 because this is not a constant aperture lens. As you zoom into 400mm, you'll find that you're using the f4.5 setting anyway. So f4.5, f5.6 will give you the sweet spot for the camera. And that's where you'll get the maximum sharpness, and there'll be enough depth of field there to give you some front to back sharpness in your subject as well, if you're only considering a flower bloom. So let me set up to take these pictures and show you the results and how to achieve this nice background blur with this particular type of camera. Well, I've set up the camera now so we can actually film a bloom that I want to photograph here of this lilac. My camera to subject distance is about 1 meter away. I've got the camera set up on a tripod so I can maintain the distance while we go through the procedures. My aperture is set to f4, as that's the minimum aperture with the camera set to 400mm, so the full extension of the camera. I'm using the AFS mode, so that's the autofocus single shot, so I've got the target set on the bloom that I want. So I'm just set the target onto the bloom that I want. Got the 2-second timer enabled so that the camera doesn't vibrate when I press the shutter button. So I'm going to take that first shot for you. And you can see that we've got a nice amount of blur behind the subject. The background is about 3 meters from this particular subject. Now if I change the aperture from f4 all the way up to f11, you'll notice that the background becomes slightly sharper, but it's still acceptably out of focus. So it's this distance that's giving you the amount of depth of field that we want in our picture, i.e. the amount of blur in the background. So let me take that picture at f11 and you can actually see the amount of subject blur behind my bloom. So if you wanted the maximum amount of blur, you were using a shallow aperture, so I'm going to use f4 again. And just to ensure that I've got enough depth of field, I'm going to go to f5.6. So with my aperture set to f5.6, it gives me a slightly deeper depth of field to ensure that I've got a front to back sharpness of the bloom that I want to take. So let's take that picture. In comparison, if I went to a wide angle setting, so I take this camera back down to the 25mm position and I get as close as I can to one of the blooms, so getting quite close, I'll set the focus point on this point. You notice that even if I take the aperture down to f2.8, the background appears to almost in the same amount of focus as the subject itself. So as that's demonstrating the amount of depth of field you get with that wide angle setting. So it's better to come back to that 1 meter and then use your longer telephoto setting to throw your background out of focus. Well, that's it for the video. I hope it answered the questions for the viewer. If you want to see more about this, there'll be a write-up on my photographic blog. I'll put a link to that in the video description below. Also, on the home page of that blog, you'll find the application to join my newsletter group, and that newsletter goes out now to just under 3,000 people every month. It's more than a newsletter, it's a technical publication in many respects. So it's a way of saying thank you for your subscription to the newsletter, and I hope you enjoy it. If you've not already subscribed, complete the application form and that gives me the authority to email you those newsletters. Then you can check out the archive of all the newsletters that go back to 2017 on there. So that's it for the video, and of course if you are a new viewer, please do click the subscribe button at the end of this video. So until the next one, thanks very much for watching, please do take care, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Goodbye for now.